Thanks, Guy. I'm going to totally move that microphone down. A giant to an ant. So hello, everyone. I'm an accountant, so I'm feeling like I might be the only one in the room. So I'm the numbers girl. So I'm here to just share some perspective around how to communicate and talk to industry. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, Bram. So, how do I get that one up? Sorry. Oh, is that all? Okay, that's easy, I think. Sorry. Right. So, I always like to start my conversations on how my journey started. So, I'm a Chief Financial Officer for many years. As a little interesting side note, I was actually the first CFO for the Great Barrier Reef Foundation about 20 years ago. And I remember being... actually it was longer than that, but anyway. But I remember walking a paper cheque for $5 million down to the bank and depositing it from BHP to go into research on the reef. That was long before they got $500 million. But back then, $5 million was a lot to a 21-year-old. Anyway, so I've had lots of roles since then, most recently in forestry in Tasmania. And my journey... I suppose with natural capital accounting, which is my passion point, started when I walked into a forest with an ecologist and we tried to have a conversation. And I don't know if you've ever tried to have a conversation with an accountant in a forest. I was talking about return on investment and inventory control and biomass and things and business cases, etc. They were talking about a whole lot of things I had no idea. Most of it was Latin. But what we did share was a passion for nature and wanting to do the right thing. And I always come back to this slide because this was a real key, is how do we actually find common language to talk to each other? How do we find that compromise in the middle? And it all came down to value. For me, what do we both value, and how do we find a common language? And that's where I found personally natural capital helped to do that. Was actually to try and take all this great work that was happening on the ground and actually turn that into really clear business cases and language to get to my investors, to the big funding and the big decision making. How do we present a really compelling story as a CFO to my board and my investors to continue to invest? We had $2 million a year going into conservation. So the Forrico estate, for just a great story, I think, that doesn't often get told. Used to be the Guns estate. Okay, anyone who knows, well, everyone, I'm going to get booed out of the room. But it's really important. I wasn't there during Guns, but 10 years later, with a really clear new set of investors coming out of receivership, degraded assets, no attention to any of this, investors came in with a really clear mandate to do things differently. And in 10 years, we turned that story around. So that was 180,000 hectares of land in Tasmania. Half of that is plantations. The other 80,000 hectares is native forest, where we made a very clear commitment that would not be harvested. So that was part of the deal we made with our community when those assets were taken over 10 years ago. And they were held for biodiversity and conservation. And I was challenged as a new CFO for that company that we were spending all this money on restoration and conservation programs, $2 million a year, with no financial return coming back. They doing it because it was the right thing to do, because the investors said this is what we need to do, this is how we do this differently. And that started our conversation around, well, what's the value? We're not going to see that in our traditional balance sheets. So we crafted some of the very first natural capital balance sheets in the world. They became famous, mainly because we started putting some very conservative values on all these services that the forest was providing beyond just providing wood chips to China or timber from our plantation, to be really clear. And you might not see there, but there's two columns. One's a value to business, which was essentially what we were transacting, and then there was this value to society. So these were all these ecosystem services that we were custodians of. And that number was 5 times more than a traditional balance sheet. And that changed the conversation around our boardroom table overnight, because and around our community. So when we launched these reports 5 years ago now, they were the first of their type in the world, the people who supported us with that was the Wilderness Society, because they said, thank you so much for acknowledging that you've got custodianship of all these really important values, of things that we value too. We didn't think that was going to happen at all. These are the same people who were chained to bulldozers, right, 10 years earlier. And they became our biggest supporters, which is a really powerful story, I think, of doing a private sector wanting to do something different and changing the narrative. Anyway, so that's kind of where we ended up. That led an accountants never go anywhere exciting, right? But I got to go to Montreal to COP15, and I was part of a significant business group actively lobbying for disclosures around nature impacts across the globe. So sometimes private sector gets cast as the villain, that we're lobbying against these kind of changes, but there was a very strong presence of us pushing government and policy and people saying we need this, investors saying we need this. This is really important to get this information to make better decisions. So that got embedded into Target 15, which then became the TNFD that got launched at the New York Stock Exchange. And I talk about the bees joining the bulls and the bears. And very deliberately this was the case. Interestingly, Foraco at that stage, because we'd been doing these natural capital reports for a long time, I somehow got talked into by Tony Goldner to do one of the first pilots. And we launched and published the very first illustrative example of talking about climate and nature at the same time. That report has been downloaded about 30,000 times globally, which is pretty exciting. So it's really about telling people how they can engage with this rather than reading 600 pages. And this is happening in this tiny little Tasmanian estate, which is pretty exciting. So ridiculous to see Tasmania and Australia profiled on the New York Stock Exchange. And I talk about this is probably really boring for you guys, but this is really important because we talk about winds of change. The financial system's changing and there's lots of really great players, and you'll hear some more from these amazing people are here doing great work. And I'm giving you hope to go and talk to private sector because they want to be there. They want to be part of the solution. They know they need to be part of the solution. So that's partly, so I went from being a CFO to a CVO, which is a bit of a cheeky way of saying CFOs were so last year. It's not just about financial anymore, it's about value. So it's about values more holistically across financial capital, natural capital, social and human capital. And part of the Capitals Coalition is an international, truly international coalition, which you probably haven't heard about, but there's about 460 organisations, including ACIUCN as part of those, who basically work in the background connecting government, finance and business and getting people talking to each other and doing that C word, the collaboration. This is how it's really happening, right? So there's about 25,000 people in the community globally. When they send out linked out reports and frameworks, about 80% of people open all of those emails, which is really high engagement from this community of people, technical partnerships. And they've got about 19 hubs across the world, including the one here in Australia, which we've just rebranded as Value Australia, to do exactly the same thing here in Australia, is to try and take all this amazing work that's happening right across this larger financial policy business landscape and get us all talking to each other so we're not duplicating and chasing our own tails and getting rid of the silos. So happy to talk to anyone who wants to learn more about this, but very much this is the world saying we're investing in Australia. We think there's amazing leadership and innovation here across all of those sectors, and they're seeing this as a real glide path before COP31 of investing in this jurisdiction and letting Australia showcase how we could do this at scale. So thank you so much. Back to you.